I should offer you at least some explanation for why I'm coming back a few weeks later and speaking again on democracy, and so I have several reasons for that. The first is I'm not exactly speaking about democracy in the sense that I did last time. Certainly last time, for those who weren't here, I just brought out that there's a tension in our fifth principle between the democratic process, which says you got to go along with it whether you agree with it or not, and conscience, which says I don't care how many people think that way, this is what. So last time when I was talking about this tension, I almost entirely talked about what I think we need to do in a divided democracy to relate to and reach out to and try to move our neighbors who may have a different point of view from ourselves. So my number one reason for coming back to a topic with democracy is to come to the other side of that tension and speak to conscience. That's reason number one. Reason number two is that since I last spoke to you, the Supreme Court have been an active bunch of persons, haven't they? We're hearing more and more about the amazing activities of former heads of state. And so I would suggest that there's really nothing more important for me to apply my philosophical or spiritual brain to the extent that I've got one, than what's going on with democracy. And then the third big reason for why I have to speak to this is I do consider myself a true patriot. And when I was in behavioral health, we had this little thing, as evidenced by, how are you going to back that up? In 1972, when I graduated from high school, the Rolling Stones and Stevie Wonder played a concert together at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., and all my friends and my girlfriend went, and I didn't. The reason I didn't is that every year on the 4th of July, we went to my grandparents on the Patuxent River, and we did a family thing, and I had a standing engagement for every July 4th, and we set off fireworks, and we celebrated my own birthday even. So my friends could not believe. This was right after the Stones had put out Exile on Main Street, and Stevie Wonder had put out Music of My Mind and was about to put out Talking Books, so it would have been an amazing concert. I hear it was. I say that to tell you how much of a patriot I am and how much July 4th means to me. So on July 3rd, I wanted to come back to the conscience of democracy. And in a way, in that same family spirit, my father, who was a Goldwater Republican, is no longer around for me to discuss politics with in various degrees of civility. But his favorite columnist, George Will, is, to my mind, the most articulate of our active thought leaders among conservative theorists. And I've been reading a lot of George Will. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to engage in a kind of distinctive debate with some of what George Will wants to say from his point of view about the conscience of democracy. I want to begin this part with a quotation from his preface, which I think is really apt for the intellectual tenor of our times. We can dignify our present disputes amongst small persons of little learning by connecting them with great debates about fundamental things. You will not hear a political debate between people who disagree that has any intellectual substance to speak of. But what is behind those points of view are principles, and principles that come down in many cases to the same principles viewed differently. So that's where we're going this morning. And what I'm going to do, if I wanted to, I could say I'm going to be referring to a distinguished political philosophical thinker, and then I could go down and make their many points. I want you to know as we're going through this, that this whole first page I'm speaking from is from George Will's most recent book, The Conservative Sensibility, okay? George Will says that when in 1943 the Supreme Court reversed itself about Jehovah's Witnesses in the flag salute case, that this was an important consideration, and he quotes, fundamental rights may not be submitted to a vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. So he completely agrees with that. In fact, that's the point that Jefferson wanted to take pains to establish in the Bill of Rights against any potential tyranny of a majority, that there would be certain rights that were guaranteed, right? That is straight Thomas Jefferson. In fact, in Jefferson's first inaugural, and again, this is Will quoting from 1801, though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal law must protect, and to violate would be oppression. That's Thomas Jefferson speaking about the importance of the rights of the minority. Will then approvingly cites that all forms of government should be judged by how well they secure inalienable rights. The Declaration of Independence preceded the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence was silent about the specific form of government, and so Will strongly believes that the stronger statement of the Declaration of Independence is the principles that any government formulated after that and on those terms must live up to. Excuse me just a moment, I'm going to get a sip of something. From my Washington Post water bottle that says, "Democracy dies in darkness." George Will says a number of things in his more recent book that really surprised me in a favorable way. Here's one. The judicial interpretive philosophy of originalism is not sufficient, he says. Critics of the court case Brown versus the Board of Education find its reasoning weak and strained, and as a result they consider the result of that decision dubious. But for George Will, and for me, that is backward. Will proposes evaluating any mode of constitutional interpretation, anything, whether you want, whatever you want to call it, textualism, originalism, whatever you want to call it. He says, here's how you should interpret these things and evaluate them. Would that approach dictate declaring public school segregation unconstitutional? In other words, would that support the if not the rationale, the conclusion of Brown versus the Board of Education? And Will says, he proposes that no acceptable theory for construing the Constitution can invalidate the court's conclusion in Brown versus the Board of Education. On the contrary, that conclusion by the court would invalidate any theory with which it countered. So, if, for instance, you are an originalist and you think, well, we should interpret these things in terms of how the people who wrote them meant them, they wouldn't have cared about whether persons who were black had any particular kind of school. They would certainly not have advocated for racial equality. Therefore, on grounds of originalism, the Brown versus Board of Education case would have no way to get started in the first place. Will is repudiating that, which, by the way, was kind of the benchmark of Scalia in a lot of ways. He goes on from there to say, and this to me is I love this. He says, conservatives have allowed their intelligence to be anesthetized by recourse to the tired formula, equality of opportunity, not of outcomes. Think about this. This is if not the leading mind of conservative thought in the United States, saying that when conservatives rely on that formula, not equality of outcomes, that's what the liberals want. They always want everybody to have the same. They always want it to come out with everybody has a bigger piece of pie. But equality of opportunity, that's what we're saying. Everybody can sleep under the bridge. No, that was Voltaire, never mind. And Will is calling this out. And he's saying it's wrong. And not only is he saying it's wrong, he's building the reasoning for why it's wrong in a way that ought to be persuasive to intelligent conservatives who pay any attention to this line of thought. To me, that is profound. I'm not going to try to change the mind of anybody who was putting a bayonet on a flagpole and walking to the Capitol on January 6th. However, principled conservatives in many cases are patriots who profoundly disagree in their approach to politics from me, and that I respect. Will says that approach to say we want equality of opportunity is facile. And the reason he calls it facile is because opportunities are conditioned upon conditions. In other words, we laugh with the Voltaire quote that rich and poor are equally free to sleep under the bridge, right? Or not to, in the case of the law. And so he's saying that the conditions like that are quite a large part of the game. Check this out. He says, the depressing truth, this is George Will saying this, the depressing truth is that inequality has deeper, more complex origins than we had thought. And he goes on for pages with a particular example that to me is so important, I'm going to, in a bullet-pointed way, follow his reasoning. At age 1, a child from a poor family is apt to be already significantly behind other children. People tend to parent as they were parented. If your parents didn't bring the best skill set to it, you're likely not going to either or parent. Educated and upwardly mobile people tend to marry each other. So there's an assortive mating going on. Will says that society's challenge, he uses a physics analogy of the escape velocity of an orbit. He says society's challenge is to give poor children sufficient outward or escape velocity from the orbit that imprisons them. He points out that poor children sense and acquire the helplessness of their parents or parent. When mothers are depressed, unstimulating, or unavailable, their baby's development is suppressed by social deprivation. Wills points out that children reared in poverty are not just behind. They are, in a sense, crippled. Will says this should shock American sensibilities because it refutes the assumption. My emphasis, but it's a strong word of his in any case. He doesn't use a lot of italicizing, as you may know if you read him. This should shock American sensibilities because it refutes the assumption that opportunities are equal as long as there are no legal or institutional barriers. We know that's not true, but it's important that he knows it's true and that he's going into this evidence and building several pages of a case for it. As he puts it, school comes too late for many children. And he concludes this. Imagine going from equality of opportunity as like, well, that's the banner for all. Imagine coming from there to this. It is undeniable that there exists an underclass trapped by the intergenerational transfer of poverty. Now, some of us understand how things like the structure of the GI Bill and who could get mortgages and who could not, where interstates were put through. Some of us understand that a lot of these things that were done by the federal government, it's not just redlining by banks, it's not just other forms of explicit prejudice, that there are many, many historical reasons why a child born in Anacostia around the Beltway from where I was born on December 25th, 1954, had a whole different life. And that goes all the way down to the house that I lived in, the house my daughter lives in, and in which my granddaughter is now being brought up. So Another conservative thought leader, Yuval Levin, has also recently recanted the myth of equal opportunity, admitting the harsher and less tractable reality of our America. In his book, A Time to Build, he points out, this is a conservative thought leader. The term institutional racism is not just a metaphor. His book is about the importance of institutions and about how we can strengthen institutions to strengthen democracy. He says, institutionalized racism is not some kind of metaphor. It's a very real and unavoidable facet of the American experience, past and present. He goes on to say that in our movement toward equal opportunity from a waspy near aristocracy, that movement toward equal opportunity existed for one generation only, and that it appears in many respects to be in retrenchment, that those, instead of broadening, it's tightening up again. So what, given these things, given these conservative thoughts, given these principles by which our country lives, given the realities on the ground, what do we do? What does our torn democracy need? I suggest that we need to ensure that the channels of opportunity are open to all, and that the channels of opportunity are not only economic opportunity. It's the stuff that begins before you're 1 year old. It's the stuff that begins with what the mother or parents or the home situation is bringing to that. It belongs to the situation of how a mother can get child care to hold down a job while having children and that kind of thing. It also goes to the broken lives of the people who've grown up in that poverty and how you could restore a kind of health to what they're experiencing. I feel like I left out some of my George Will stuff. Was I holding back on that on you? No, I remember now. Okay. I was holding a little bit back, but I get it to you. So, to open the channels of opportunity, not just in economic terms, but in social opportunity, in cultural opportunity, so that every American citizen can grow into the lived and felt experience of pride in being an American. Yascha Mounk has written a book recently called The Great Experiment. Why diverse democracies fail, or rather, why diverse democracies fall apart and how they can endure. And he coins a phrase for one perspective on a solution, or at least a good-making property, cultural patriotism. He says, for the great experiment to succeed, we must build diverse democracies that actually attract the wholehearted support of their members. Societies whose residents feel pride in the collective accomplishments. So on this 3rd of July, as we anticipate tomorrow, the 4th, is there something we can all love in America, as I did at that year I graduated from high school and loved it enough to forgo the Rolling Stones and Stevie Wonder? I want to take one line of thought to lead into a possibility there. Could we argue that a vital democracy requires a diversity of political or political philosophical perspectives? That a vital democracy needs people like me and it needs people like George Will. It needs that clashing, that diversity of points of view. Perhaps we could shift our gestalt from saying that right and wrong are the two sides, and you think you're right, I think you're wrong, I think I'm right, you think I'm wrong, from that right and wrong thing to complementary values like focus and range in optics. Imagine that two people are setting up a visual experience for people, and one person says, we've got to take everything in. It's got to include everything. And the other person says, no, we've got to focus. It's got to be absolutely clear. The more you clear, what do you do? The more you focus, what do you do to your range? And the more you expand the range, what do you do to your focus? You dissipate it. I would suggest that the diversity that's complementary that we need for our democracy is like focus and range. That if we're only coming at it from one side, we're missing something. So, I believe that there is a range of possible balancings, say between George Will and myself, that could fall within normal limits, as you might see that on a nursing assessment. In medical terms and in the terms that Thomas Kuhn used in Philosophy of Science when he talked about normal and revolutionary science, I believe that there are balances of multiple sorts that are within normal limits in that you're not in crisis. But we seem to be right now. So I suggest we accept this challenge. First, thinking of your own approach to philosophies of politics, how can you clarify your political perspectives so they are most clearly cast in the light of the Declaration's principled self-evidence? Think of the Declaration of Independence statements about we hold these truths to be self-evident. How can we take our own political beliefs and frame them in terms of those self-evident truths? Now, the second part, which psychologists tell us we're not very good at, look at the other point of view. Look at the complementary side and say, how might that perspective be framed most clearly in terms of the light of those same, or that same set of self-evident principles? For right now, I would suggest that as we're thinking through that, as you're reflecting on it, bracket off not only the political sausage making, bracket off everything in the Constitution about the form of government and what's allowed and not allowed. Just focus on rising up to the level of conscience, of self-evident, moral, undying truth. Look for that. Because I contend that all of us need that. And that if you come up with something and you say, well, here's a solution to how we can all do this and get along, and I feel like you're tricking me at this other level because my conscience feels like there's something going on that isn't being met here. If you can't satisfy my conscience, I'm not going to go along with it. And the same is true of my very Trumpian brother. His conscience works the same way for him. So here's the bold play. This is my bold play move on this July 3rd. We might have pretty deep agreement on the most fundamental, most American values. That all are created equal, that all are endowed with unalienable rights, that these include the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that government is instituted to secure those rights, that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, that should any form of government become destructive of those ends, we have a duty to change it. I think George Will and I would equally affirm all those principles, however radically the differences in what we thought the implications might be. So for me, to come to the conscience of democracy is the only hope for ultimately moving toward healing in our torn democracy. It won't be a matter of compromise over the distribution of resources. It will be some kind of dawning recognition that the conscience of American democracy that we're worshiping in our way tomorrow somehow must include all Americans, regardless of our political philosophies. At a time when many are celebrating the rights of the unborn, what rights might you lose by being born? Are all these babies, rich and poor alike, created equal? If you believe so, something should follow from that. If they are created equal, that apparently doesn't last long in our America. Will says that a society of truly equal opportunity is now a fading chimera, an illusion, a vanishing dream. He points out that there are really effective programs that transform the lives of mothers and their children who need that. But he says there are too many families like that, and it costs too much. It can't be done. He says that using public policies to create or recreate a healthy family culture is a challenge beyond our capabilities. He offers no alternative. He just moves on to the next topic. The week before last, I streamed several webinars by those who dedicate themselves to finding ways to help. The series was on post-traumatic stress, which, as most of you know, often stems from repeated adverse childhood experiences of the kind that we were associating with poor children frequently. I was struck by how the developing brain just breaks in its pathways, how memory and cognition are disrupted along with disorganized attachment. Author and neuropsychiatrist Dan Siegel, in particular, explained the effect as a disintegration within the brain, throughout the person, and across interpersonal space, a failure of integration. Perhaps, just as the seriously traumatized person lacks integration, and just as a healing process would have to include integration, I might suggest the same of America writ large. I say George Will is right about the declaration we celebrate tomorrow, but wrong about those wasted babies. Wrong because we can say as Americans, because we can insist as Americans that all are created equal, all have intrinsic dignity and worth. And if we have so effed up our history, as the president might have put it previously, that it has come to the wreckage described by George Will, then it is our American crisis and our civic duty to do what the conscience of democracy calls us to. Some, many, perhaps most, will object that in our divided state we have no political will to heal. To that I say, let us try together. Let us dare ourselves to show how great America can be. The hardest tests, yes, we have in us the greatness for that, because we are America, the city on the hill. Happy Independence Day.